other audience, you have great interest to ask questions, we can consider to extend a little bit, okay? If Ms. Latz have some more minutes. So if you have a question, welcome to tap in the chat box, and or you can speak up by just turn on your mic after the presentation, okay? So I will give the time to Ms. Latz now, and thank you, Ms. Latz. Yeah, you muted yourself, unfortunately.
Oops, is it now better?
Thank you, thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's the technology thing. Maybe even in 10 years, we won't have made it with online talks and still make the same mistakes. I don't know. Well, but thank you first, Bin, for this introduction. I was very pleased to receive your invitation from the University of Hong Kong, a place where I must confess I haven't been yet. So I really regret that I cannot be with you, but it is really an honor to speak in front of you today. Although in front of you is of course a stopgap, because on the one hand, an online lecture cannot replace the quality and chemistry of a real presence. On the other hand, the pandemic leaves us no other choice. Before the unfortunately necessary restriction, I was in Asia several times each year and fondly remember the intensive exchange with hosts, students and other guests. But in fact, it is also an opportunity to meet online. To accelerate international exchange and above all to multiply it. And so for the time being, I thank Bin and Jiali Li, I hope I spell it right, for your patience in the preparation of this lecture. And I would like to apologize again to you for any inconvenience I may have caused with my very late replies. But now to the lecture. Yeah, climate change and COVID pandemic make it really clearer than any time before, that we need good public space. That's the thing, that we need to have public space around us, where we live, where we are, and that this public space should do more possibly than it very often does. It should also be able to address the identity of a place and the identity of a region. And that's what I want to work on. I mean, already in 2009 at the UN climate conference, which so dramatically, I think, failed, the world was looking with bright eyes on what we did. What for me was the most important lesson is, and I think that's clearer than any time before, that it is up to us to develop our future and develop the world. We in Europe, we are permanently fighting with the cliches and with the things we have in our head. And one of the strongest cliches in Central Europe, for example, is that of paradise. It exists in all other cultures as well, in a different form, with a different religion and a different background, but it's always the same. I mean, we want to be in a place where we feel free and where we are not really limited by so many things. And public space should, to a certain way, be like this. The other extreme we experienced, of course, in the long run after that, was the idea to manage nature, to control it to an absolute maximum. And this has steered the perception of nature and the perception of landscape for centuries, until in the 19th century, a new picture rose up, which becomes more and more important, but is also just a picture, I must say. It was driven by famous painters, but also by people doing music, philosophy, and other stuff. And this is our background. In a different way, again, this is happening more or less all around the world. And we're getting closer and closer to natural phenomena. In Europe, by a detour over Romanticism, which of course was conveying a picture which possibly doesn't have to do a lot with reality. but it is beautiful, and that's what we're looking for. At the same time, we detect that nature is much more. It's all these little things maybe my little daughter didn't like when she was 6 years old. It's about a construction. It's about where we live in. And more than before, mankind is living in a constructed nature. We don't know anymore what is real and what is fake. We don't know anymore what is a clear construction which is influenced by mankind and human technology, and whether a mountain which we see on a picture is a real mountain or just animated. While in fact the reality we have to live with and should deal with also as landscape architects is that of huge agriculture, of very big and huge agriculture, even if ecologic, that will be the future reality. It is about huge cities which are massive, just a picture from Mexico City. We live in a mass culture. We live in a culture where every time something important is happening, we're dealing with thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. And we're dealing a lot with infrastructure. This is basically the basis of our culture. It's the basis of where we are in, and it's not the romantic picture, and it has never been the romantic picture we lived in. And it is also our culture. And we take that notion, culture, very serious. It's the technical infrastructure. It is cars, it is trucks, unfortunately also motorways, but it's up to us to design it in a way that it is more acceptable for us to live with it and to be with it, to accept such structures right beside us. The way it is done on this picture is certainly not the future. Up to the extremes which have been created, I mean, that's just a picture from somewhere in the United States, but it can be anywhere, all around the world. And I remember the first steps from communities in Europe, where we had where we took part in an exhibition in Barcelona, where the discussion was hosted on how to interpret that invasion of this one-sided mean of transport, and how the city, which was Barcelona, reacted to this threat of public space, of use within public space, of a good public space. And so I come back to my first phrases, which are saying we need good public space. We cannot just hand it over to one very single-oriented mean of transport, but we need to conquer it, to make the cities good again, to really allow us to construct a city of the 15 minutes distance where we don't need a car or bigger means of transport to get what we need to enjoy living where we are. And a large part of that is also underground infrastructure. I'm not going to talk about this, but rather the visible infrastructure, the train tracks, the canals, the fragmented landscape around it. And I'm talking about landscape which is bigger than what we are usually doing in our landscape pieces. I know that projects in China tend to be very big, the bigger ones at least. There's also very small ones. But I also want to have a sensibilized situation that we are not the only ones. The biggest landscape architects in the world are basically large engineering firms protecting our countries from flooding, from other threats of nature. Yeah, so we live in a constructed environment. We're not living in a natural environment anymore. And we have to deal with other things which come to us. And it is a task of our office also. I mean, that's what we're specialized in, to deal with these kind of big infrastructural landscapes and what we do with it once the landscape is exploited. Or we deal with what we usually don't think so much about. It's the places we create by being a mass society. So used waste dumps, and of debris of the cities, which we reconstruct permanently, as well as literal waste, where people are even living on. That is a task which is certainly a big task in the future. But let's go back. Our cliche about how we live together is still nurtured, especially in Europe, Western Europe, and the Western world, by the ideal little nice city, you know, where everybody comes together. Of course, that's not reality. And I'm convinced also in a modern city, we can live quite nicely. I visited Tokyo about 25 years ago, and it was a crazy city, but it was very well organized. It had a very clear organization, and the people took really care of the public space. They cleaned it personally. They took care of it. They put plants over there. Even private people have put their planting pots out into public space, and nobody damaged it. Nobody ever did anything because there's a respect. There's a principal notion of public space as a shared, very valuable good. And when you look back into history also, infrastructure, and this is a large infrastructure, becomes a park. This is an agricultural landscape, which is considered a park, of course, here for the ruling people in Morocco, and it still exists. It's an amazing place when you go through, where paradise is not necessarily a crazy, powerful picture, but it is a successful and I wouldn't say ecologic, but a good, friendly, human kind of agriculture. And also infrastructure, even military infrastructure, can become public space temporarily or permanently. So the former bastions in Europe have been used largely by the city dwellers for as a public space for their free time. They met over there, and only after a very short while, when these structures haven't been necessary anymore, they've been turned into new parts of the city or ring parks around the city centers. Until this system came, which was still a very interesting city, because the walkways, that's a picture from Paris, the walkways are still large and people could still cross a street with a lot of danger, of course, already. But the whole street was still part of a kind of permanent daily attraction. And I think we need to go back to this. We need to fight back for our infrastructure, and we need to fight with ourselves and with our perception, because large parts of our perception today are made by a very special program. It's the internet. It's viewing the world through something which is completely constructed. It's artificial and nothing, and this will never replace really visiting a place in real, but that's the way people see it. We have to deal with the colors, with the light, and with that Instagrammable idea, which makes living together more and more complex and even complicated. But when you look about infrastructure, I also see spectacular places. What is a threat? That's a picture from London. It still exists. What can be considered as a threat can also be considered as an enormous challenge and opportunity for a city. I think that these spaces are dramatic, they are spectacular, and they can make our life, even for normal working people, like around this gas holder, something which suddenly becomes a spectacular and really interesting thing. I think the technical elements have potentials, high potentials for our future. And when we leave the cliches about our city a little bit aside, I am quite convinced that this makes it per se more interesting. I will just show two projects today. Some sounded a lot, which pay tribute to former generations' successes and defeats. And what I want to question is the traditional process of demolition, construction, and reconstruction by replacing it with a positive and proactive interpretation of given man-made constructions. I think the question is always, when you look at such a place, could be anywhere, what shall we do with this? Take it down for millions? Just to recycle some steel and create rubble out of concrete to do sublayers of streets, and spend millions for decontamination, and in the end just to create a new super designed landscape and integrating cliches of nature or park? Wouldn't that just be another destruction of what was once a destruction of nature? What nature? And isn't that a monument of hard labor and economic success, of an era which was building up a nation and a population of millions? Isn't that the identity of a place, a city, a region, a country? We think that this is a place of culture. This is a monument, better than any museum, and ready to fascinate people, to steer their imagination. This is a place of remembrance and a place of endeavor and adventure, always better than any museum could ever be it. Its nature is rich and its potentials are enormous. This is landscape. It is a cultural landscape. And so we decided to make use of it, smell it, touch it, climb it. When we were drawing the first pictures, we detected a landscape which is far more complex than anything else, and it's already there. It's built with millions of, this here, Deutschmarks, 100 years ago, and replacing it with something else for us could only be a disappointment and need another set of hundreds of millions of euros, but it's already there, and we just need to detect it. So we found several different layers, a lower layer, a higher layer, the layer of the architectural, let's say engineered objects rather, but the most interesting is the so-called Bahnpark, the train park, because that is the principle of such a heavy industry system of the 19th century. The train park is a huge earth sculpture. It's an enormous, huge element which connects everything, not only within the park, but also to the outside. It connects to things we think about, a mental landscape in other countries, where the coal came from later on, where the people come from. It is something which is training our imagination. And by developing this landscape further, we find an enormous amount of special species, red list species like mad. I think Duisburg North, for example, is the biggest red list resort in Germany. And we found very beautiful species together with the leftovers of industry. It's specific soils, not always contaminated, and very specific plants along the former train tracks. We found out that just working with these systems and rebuilding them, not really, but rather continuing to build them, makes us profit from a large system which already exists, make it bigger, and combine the two systems, the design, an engineered design, a new design with the other stuff, and give access to places you didn't have before. And within these places, create sites of a different interest, a little paradise, something where you go in and at the same time feel the spectacular force of 3-meter thick concrete sometimes, and having isolated spaces, as well as spaces which train your imagination. You're asking yourself, what has been there? What was there before? And when landscape takes over, the natural landscape takes over, the whole thing becomes even more beautiful. It's like an old castle or an old chateau, a ruin of something which transports so much history and so much life, and is much spectacular than any park you could ever build, and at the same time very real, not an isolated event, but something which draws on industry on the whole world. It's also a teaching lesson, and it's great to climb it, to walk through it and experience these places. At the same time, our task was always, when we worked on that, and I was working on this project as a student, and besides my work as an architect, sometimes on holidays also, I was working in the office. But in this project, my parents did basically, we also had the task to make it possible for many people to walk at landscape, because sometimes the machinery is quite strong. And so landscape is the key to get into it, to allow access and permanent occupation. We found places which in the first site, we didn't know really what to do with it. In the competition, we were the only ones who kept the full structure. All the others destroyed everything except the blast furnaces. But this is more spectacular even than a mountain where we walk on. This is the big bunkers where suddenly the people are climbing. We have all difficulties over here up to 10, I think. And it's the biggest alpine club we're having in Duisburg North in whole Germany. So instead of driving to the Alps every weekend, you can do it here now, and they love it. And at the same time, it's very spectacular for visitors to pass by and have a look. We integrated playgrounds, which are very different to any playground somewhere in the world. Playgrounds which are part of the history of the site, who profit from these enormous constructions and are spectacular. Although I must say, this is one of the defeats we had, because now people are driving even from far away to this place with their kids. So that's something we didn't anticipate. So we are creating a larger CO2 footprint with this one, seeing it with today's eyes, but it is a success. And also hosting the BMX championships. However, another thing we learned is that for the frog, it's not so important if the water is squared or has a natural edge. For him, what is important is water, is plants and life. And this works, and it works for the frogs, as it does work also for divers in the gas holder. A very simple thing. We just filled it with water and we have a diving club there. And that works. You don't need to do much more. The investment is, to the largest extent, already existing. So you save money again and make it a spectacular place. The sewer of the Ruhr was already meant to disappear in the underground. What we did is we tried to direct the money for the reconstruction in a way that the construction above still reflects the history of the place. And that's what it does today. It's linear systems of organization, which are based on the historic systems of orientation. They are melted together. So you have a historic experience and a new park experience at the same time. We try to integrate also natural forces for moving water, but the systems are so strong and creating so much energy that this one is now not working anymore and just standing there as a symbol because it was too successful, but the central technical element broke. So we have to repair it every 3 to 5 years. But this is a symbol for people who drive by on the motorway for the renewal of the Ruhr, of that huge industrial landscape we're talking about. And the inside symbols are reused materials we just found on site in a place a little bit away from here and just recollected and rearranged to make a place, you can't believe it, which is now one of the most important places for the parties of the quarter just close by. And they love it and they do it every year, except of course now. And it's also a place for other festivals, for celebration, for art presentations, and for kids. And it is possible, I think, because it is a very strong place. It's in its materiality, in its existence, and is so telling on very different levels, even without any tree. I mean, these places we found somewhere, and it's always the story of iron and how it was made and constructed, which is present when you walk through the park, but nicely melting also with other elements. For example, the big turbine hall was meant to disappear. Experts said, we don't know how to restore it and what to do with it. We cannot isolate it and we cannot really use it, so take it down. And Peter, my father, as well as the director of the International Building Exhibition, who was responsible for this project to a large extent, they said, no, we wait and we do something over there, which is there because there is no isolation, because there is no super cool whatever performance material. So since the machinery which had been there was already out, you have a fantastic space, just sheltered. And they just turned it with a few little interventions, just some isolation for the sound, and cleaning the surface. This is now one of the most desired places in the Ruhr for big festivals, for celebrations, for parties, presenting the new candidate, for music, and even fashion fairs and the presentation of the new Volkswagen. So this works and it makes money. It brings money to the park, like the other stage within the blast furnaces itself, quite spectacular. It makes money to the park. A third of the money, 1.5 million euros per year, is created by events, just by renting out spaces, not selling them. You need to keep the power over this. Never sell anything. This is public space, but to rent it out temporarily, which is quite fascinating. Well, there was one event which is always important in this, is what happens to such structures. When they are abandoned, there's a lot of destruction, vandalism, and whatever. And that vandalism stopped immediately by a very simple trick, and I come back to that image making thing. It's by inviting Jonathan Park, the director of the IBA Emscher Park of the International Building Exhibition, he brought in a little bit something spectacular. So Jonathan Parker was working for Pink Floyd and others on their tours to put the light and to organize the stage. He was doing this, following a little bit the process of making steel. And suddenly when people saw it who lived around very deprived and poor areas, rather, workers, they said, oh, this is like on TV. This must be something special. That's what I heard. People told me that. And so from one day to the other, vandalism stopped almost completely. And this park has no light at night. It's dark. It's dark. It's 200 hectares, more or less dark, except some places where you can get something to eat, or you have to secure a club, but most of that is dark, which is good for nature. And it's safe. And you just have this light installation on weekends. Artists also profited from the specific nature of that place and make it even more interesting, but this is temporary by Daniel Buren. What is much more driving is the silhouette of the blast furnaces as a symbol for the change in the Ruhr. And when you look at that today, more or less the same angle like the first picture, it's a big green landscape. What has been gray and dark today is green. I can only recommend to visit the Ruhr because there is many projects about former industrial fabric, but this one is certainly one of the biggest ones. But when the park was created in the 90s, nobody would have ever thought that it becomes a green and accepted and loved place like this one. And I think it's maybe due to the story that the park was developed by making it. There was not a plan at the beginning, and that's how we did it. We came there, we had a concept on how to work with it, and the plan was drawn afterwards. Such a process, I think, is very successful on post-industrial parks and landscapes because it gives you the opportunity to work much more with the existing and what you find. So we did draw some lessons from that about, my father calls it anti-destruction projects. I call it a kind of re-endeavor. It's about developing a philosophy before a design and starting to work before really designing things. And to take enough time for these new strategies because they have to be strong and resilient to everything you find, to understand what we're dealing with, how the production worked and how all these elements are fit together because people can reuse it. So we develop from the existing. It's important to see the spaces we get before we add any functions because we believe strongly that we have to invent the functions into these spaces rather than having a big, a pot of ideas for functions and then to just implement them on such places. We need to be more sensitive. And we need to develop it with a view to history, because this is the identity of the place. This is the identity of the workers. And we have to create, we have to creatively put solutions and designs to these areas. We also learned, but that's a topic I wasn't focusing on today, to stop the soil tourism as much as possible, because decontamination costs an enormous amount of money, to rather create landscapes here, save it, store it, fix it. And especially, and that is important, understand the new nature of something. It is so rich of species because you have such very, very different substrates. We call that technosoil internationally, and you can do something with it. And that leaves us to the question, do we really need to destroy the destruction again? I show you a second project which we were working on in Israel since 2004. We were advising the city and an arts-related association on what to do with a landfill close to the city of Tel Aviv. And the landfill was going to be closed because the airport right beside had more and more problems with the birds nesting and being on top. So basically what was working when we've been there first time was already closed, I think in 2002. And 2004, we won a competition on this landfill and what to do with it with a very simple project. We interpreted this landfill, which was very steep and spectacular in the flat landscape of Tel Aviv, as a monument and a place of orientation, as well as a memorable place, a place of memory. And it is quite clear when you look from an aerial photo that all the people driving by with their car use this as an orientation point in the always the same looking cityscapes we have. Even in Tel Aviv, the outskirts look the same like everywhere. And so we proposed simply a stabilization of that dramatic landfill, of this form in the landscape, by just putting a foot terrace around it so that this kind of enormous pudding cannot collapse anymore. That was important also due to the fact that we had two rivers going alongside, the Shapirim and the Ayalon River, which were destabilizing the foot of that landfill, a very dangerous thing. I mean, you hear every year about collapsing landfills because they become bigger and bigger, and suddenly water or rainfall makes them collapse. So we created this space around, which was considered as an agricultural place, not to save money, but to make it a productive landscape which you can still enjoy. And of course, this space, and this is a further drawing we did much later, together with engineers consulting us, basically by respecting the fact that there is still leachate and that the side of the landfill is still open because the gas was only sucked out at the top. And finally, all this, these berms were built with recycling material from the cities. You cannot imagine how much debris we get by the demolition of buildings and what you can do with it in a landscape. We were working with water-saving systems, underground systems, with the liner on top of the hill, collecting the rainwater at the edge to make it possible to use it, just to keep what we get on site. So it's a kind of mini sponge, you could say. And finally, develop the terrain in a flexible way because everything was still moving and is still moving today a little bit. I mean, the whole thing is a landfill. And we organized systems on how to get the water. So everything is following water flow, logic systems. So the design is completely developed by the logic of how to retain water, how to organize flow, and where vegetation is possible. It could be also the place where the water is collected. A main feature was the central, we called it oasis. From the beginning, this was the oasis. It is a kind of sheltered place where the wind doesn't get in so far, this depression, where they did some extraction of materials and brought it to the recycling area, but also storing it on top. And we developed this design for this oasis, where in the center, we even wanted to collect the rainwater we have or store water and have a counter world to the outside harsh appearance, which we wanted to keep. And this is only possible with flexible systems for retaining walls. This was dry walls. It's a system which is very much used in the Mediterranean, in Europe, but certainly also in all countries around the world. System of smaller stones which you pile up carefully and that can move. So in detail, it does everything we need and at the same time is ecologically highly interesting. A hard concrete wall would have been impossible. And this kind of flexible system, we did some speculations about it, like this one, would not tolerate any stair like this. So this was avoided. And we had ideas on how it could look like. Nice. On the lower right, you see a picture from our home garden over here, which is also right beside the office, where we experimented with recycling material and we thought it's nice, like on the upper picture, but it turned out to be different. I tell you that in a minute. We of course worked with the water on how to get it here, because the image we wanted to create is that of a real oasis, where the water is rather stored in the underground so that it cannot evaporate quickly into the air. Water saving is one of the most important topics in Israel. And so we developed these plans, all systems which can still move a little bit and still serve their function. And finally had an underground storage, like in an oasis, where just part of the water would be visible. In the construction, of course, we're a little bit classic. The top of the landfill is sealed. Then gets all these systems. For the first fill, of course, we had a lot of water to pump up the hill. First fill is always the most problematic. And the landscape evolved. You see the retaining walls with the recycling material from the city. The park comes into place, can still move without losing its image and its picture. But the walls have become massive because the destruction of Tel Aviv and the rebuilding of Tel Aviv, at the moment Tel Aviv is changing drastically. There's so many people who still go to Israel every year, not only Jews from all around the world. And they build higher and higher buildings and take down the old ones. And we took that debris. So some of these slabs are bigger than a room. And we just piled them up, which is good because then nobody will ever take it away again. And it looks like this. It's getting green and nice. And people are coming here because this is a spectacular and beautiful place. It works. Maintenance is not so intense. But it is also spectacular, of course, how you can use the place. So the only stable place, this was the crushing platform, which was piled up concrete from the bottom till the top. We have a restaurant as a permanent island where people are over the whole week, and then on weekends, well, the Jewish weekends, it's full of people, where it's more and more overgrowing. I mean, this is a picture from 4 years ago. Now it's really growing fast like mad, where we have a lot of water and an ecological surface, really nice working stuff. Recycling materials, which we found. This is basically the restaurant, which was fully built with recycled materials. And then finally, another place on where we go up from the recycling plant. There's a recycling plant right beside where people from all around Israel, big groups, are coming to learn about recycling within that facility, working together with social workers and artists and other people to create pieces with art, seatings with art. Everything is done with garbage. And then you walk up from that place after knowing about what that place is made of and what could become, what could be made with trash. You walk up the trash. I mean, this is still an animation. It's still under construction. It's this part, the walkway up. At the moment, it's just an asphalt street where we also have to add extra material. So building waste will be put to stabilize this. And finally, you look down into the recycling plant. That's the image of what we're hoping to have one day. Not exactly like this. The design will be adapted. And then you get up on the top of that enormous hill. This is an early year picture where everything is green. Most of the year, of course, it's brown and dry, especially the slopes. And on that hill, the landscape is taken over by natural processes. We were just seeding a bit and planting a bit within the water collection lines, and it creates a new and very specific landscape, which is attractive for people to walk, sustainable, doesn't need a lot of maintenance, because it's working with the water we have. We're just pumping a very little bit in the driest seasons. And then finally, we get to a place which we constructed as something which could also move. So kind of concrete platform, a stable platform which can move, and has a structure on top which can also move. We called it parachutes in the beginning, but that's not a good symbol in Israel. So later on, we called it simply the brise soleil, the umbrellas, which protect a space of very specific quality with the vegetation around, which makes this the place to go for the people of Tel Aviv and tourists, for school classes, to watch out over, to learn about vegetation and watch out over the white city of Tel Aviv. It's quite nice. It's an outstanding place because also what you're having here is concerts, is readings, and it has become one of the most expensive venue places in the whole Israel, and people want to come. So also this place is making a bit of money. While all this happened, we had another competition on water. You might not believe it, but Israel, which is rather in a dry zone, has a problem with water, and it's a rising problem. Because due to the fast colonization of the landscape of Israel, as well as in the neighboring states and in Gaza Strip, different story, there's so much water floating down, there's no sponge wherever. So more and more landscape is sealed, which leads, because the water is drained through a small channel through the city, which is not enough, leads to inundations almost every year at the beginning of the year, so January, February especially, and you have up to 1 meter of water within the city. It's a big problem. So the brief for that other competition for the landscape around Hiria was to retain 7 million cubic meters of rainwater. In the meantime, it was heightened to 14 and we said it's impossible, and it was lowered again to 7. So within that landscape, this huge basin should have been created, a basin for 7 million cubic meters of water. That's enormous. And the idea Latz+Partner have brought up is to say, okay, guys, we dig out a landscape, but we're not putting that to the edge of the park in order to create a huge super paradise, but we want the city to be connected to it. So the second version, to have this landscape, was chosen, and to have these kind of steep elements, the attractive landscape where a lot can happen within the park, in the center of the park. The second thing was an idea for the water. We said, let the water in to the park, make it a park, flood it. That's a spectacular thing. And we have different weir systems, which I will talk about later a little bit. We need a kind of detour around. So the first million cubic meters of waters will be driven around this area because it's full of garbage and full of dust and other stuff, which we don't want in a public park. And then, so that's how this would look like. It's this kind of water corridor. We call it also green corridor, although in this most of the year it won't be. And then the water, which usually is just a tiny little stream, the Shapirim and the Ayalon River, which we take around the hill, will then become heavier and heavier. So you have the kind of light rain event. You have the 20 years flood, which I think is already the 10 years flood now, with all the climate change issues. The 100-year flood, which might come now every 50 years or 40 years. Until we reach a space which we then said this will become a park, a green park. We're driving the design systems from the existing agricultural systems. We wanted to say we drive our full design out of that, because this is a signal of plenty. This is not a signal of industrial landscape. This is a signal of richness for these people, because they are in an arid climate. And the biggest achievement in Israel is a highly intense and very effective agriculture by drip irrigation. So these systems create the landscape. Everything you see here is meant to become orchards and olive groves, where the people do this kind of holiday. They like it because they are in the shade. They like the surface because they can run all around without any risk. You can do so many different things in an orchard or in an olive grove in these regions. It's fantastic. You can park your car there without any problem. You don't need to build a parking. You just park there. It's huge, it's big, no problem. You just check the area and you save a lot of money, but for better things than a parking. And then finally, we create some basins where we store the water, the recycled water, the cleaned water, to make this most precious element in Israeli culture an asset with the mountain behind. We have landscapes on different levels going into the whole. We have the edge corridor, which we call the active corridor, where many things can happen, events happen, picnics happen, etc., even when a light flood is happening. We have recycling areas where we need to put the water on a higher quality in order to be able to use it, because the Shapririm and the Ayalon are not clean rivers. And finally, within that huge 7 million cubic meter hole, we create on a lower base where we are closer to groundwater, a fantastic park with the scenery, with that scenery behind. What will happen, of course, is that the rivers, the little rivulets which go through, will have usually a quality of high acceptance, because it's the typical green cliche of landscape, very dense, which then can flood eventually and needs to be crossed with little bridges and walkways. So this is just an image, it's not built yet. We hope that something like this is going to come, very simple engineered constructions, which make it possible to cross the park even when it's flooded, but also to get people through to the other places. I show you a last example, what we want to do with the outlet weir. It's a big weir. You see on the upper picture a kind of first fast image by the engineers. It's old already. And we said, let's do something with that. We cannot do this because then we need to close it and do whatever. We think that the constructions for such a huge engineering thing should become usable so that people can climb there, look at a spectacular engineered structure, which is possibly beautiful, just by a little bit more of money. Something we could address to. This is our origin. This is our identity, especially the society in Israel is built on a man-made land. And then to have something where you can climb, where you can experience, where you have artificial constructions, where you enjoy a man-made landscape, an oasis, like an emperor's garden 100, 200, or 500 years ago. Yeah, this park is still under construction. In Israel, it's not like in China, I must say. In Israel, everything follows biblical times. Due to the fact that it's a small country, big projects are always problematic, except airports. And this construction is something which is really astonishing. And this is an older picture already. Some of the stream around are already built, but it's the only picture I have with that view to Tel Aviv. And it has already been filled several times with floodwater, so it starts working, but we're still not there. And I hope until I am basically stopping to work, which is hopefully far away, I will still experience that park realized. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ms. Latz. So this is a spectacular landscape design and planning. I appreciate the strategies and the philosophy, the foundation for this project. I think that's a very important success. And then we talk about the landscape design interventions at different scales, right? So it's really helpful. Thank you so much for this lecture. Now we will open the floor to the audience. So you're encouraged to turn on your video camera and direct talk to Miss Latz. Or if you are not not convenient, you can type in the chat box, and I can deliver the question to Miss Latz. So maybe you can start to write down. I will have some questions. Some questions I always have in my mind for quite a long time. I think you probably already know that the projects done by your parents and yourself have a huge impact in Asia. And actually, many cities are following your philosophy and design methodology on many projects. So, in China, for example, we have a big region, which is the Northeast region, was an industrial region since the 1930 till 1980. So we had many factories have been neglected for years or decades in that region. And now many cities are following this your example to consider to build up the industrial park. But there is one concern for that is, well, this factory looks very interesting for people outside the region. But for the local people, they see this kind of factories in a quite a frequent way. And also, if every city in that area builds similar projects, then creates a competition of the tourism and the recreational market, right? So how do you think this kind of strategic thinking at the regional scale, if many cities are considering build up this kind of industrial parks or industrial renovation sites? Right. Thank you.
That's a very good question. And it is interesting to see that it is closely linked on how you treat the old stuff. Let's take it that way. How you treat the fabric you find. One thing is, if we just make it an attraction, it will not so much work for the local population. You need to make it something which keeps them being proud that it has been something important. It's like a castle somewhere, where you look at and you say, well, this is our history. That's where our emperor lived, or our shogun in Japan, or our king in Germany. This is basically the castle of the workers. And if we treat it in the way that the workers can still access it, and use it for new everyday purposes, then it works. And that is what so fantastically worked in Duisburg. This park is not integrating a museum. It is not integrating commercializing some places. It is not integrating huge attractions and things which are more interesting for tourists, but it is integrating the needs of the local people. So we have that in some areas, for allotment gardens, need for space which is beautiful and integrates them. So especially having connections to the surrounding neighborhoods, good connections, is extremely important. And give them space to breathe. The difference to where they live, where everything is close and is tight, that you have a space where you can breathe, a space for the people and not just for events. And then what is also important is that you integrate for them possibilities to eat and drink, things that it doesn't become too expensive, that they can access a blast furnace and just walk on it without paying for it, because that is another big problem in some of the places where post-industrial landscapes have been re-commercialized. You can do that, but it's not good for the identity of the people. And finally, I think, and that is also important, is that to a certain extent you integrate their culture on how to use public space. And I see in many places that this is not done. It is either over-designed or it has too many attractions, which doesn't really make it something where the people can, how do you say, take possession of, mentally. And also to respect the stories behind. And that has a lot to do with how we treat it. I mean, in Duisburg, we have a great special opportunity, which is the heavy industry structure, which is based on the rail, as I said in the beginning. A modern industry today is much more based on trucks, which is usually not very attractive. And these rail lines you can change into bicycle ways, into walkways and other stuff, and welcoming people, who live around, which usually haven't changed a lot. Yeah, I mean, what they need is new workplaces, of course, and we have to make some sacrifices. I mean, also in the Ruhr, I would say that not all post-industrial places could be saved and transformed. Most of them are transformed into new production places, new workplaces, even if it happens in the old fabric. But we have to keep some of them, maybe the most spectacular ones, those with the highest potential of integrating collective functions which are there for everybody and are free of charge. I think this is a principle for public space.
Thank you so much. This is so wonderful answer. I never find it in another book. The first
time I mean, it's always the discussion, I mean, the charge thing, how to make money with something is a driving thing in a capitalistic world. And we live in a capitalist world, however you interpret it in detail. So everything has to make money, has to economize itself. You have to make a business case. But the business case with such fabric, like with a classic park, a business case, not I make directly money with it, but it is a service to the people and the society. And we just have to think is what is part of the service. And I think that if you have such a chance to have such a spectacular fabric, whether it's a kind of natural beauty or an industrial fabric, then you need to think about how can this become a great thing in a public place. And we're working like that every time. As soon as you commercialize it, it's another strategy. It's absolutely valid. We are working on such projects as well. That's fine. It's a different thing.
Yes, totally agree. Okay. Anyone have a question? Has a question? So you can even type the Chinese if you prefer Chinese. I can translate that for you. Okay, if you don't ask question, I will take the privilege to ask other questions. Okay, we got a question.
There's questions in the chat.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat about whether we have studied the impact of food quality grown next to and on landfill urban debris.
That's a good question.
That's a very good question, because that is the biggest fear, especially of politicians, who never want to take responsibility. And usually the answer is either we decontaminate completely or we don't do it. I didn't talk about decontamination today because it's something we need to look at differently in every project. We have places also within Duisburg which had been heavily contaminated. And it was fortunately only little spots. But of course, we have to take care of it. And our idea was we are not recycling in a classic way. We don't make the soil tourism, send it somewhere to be recycled and then come back, because it costs a lot of money and we wanted that money for the park. But we said, we put it somewhere, we seal it, make something with it, and leave it there until either we know better what to do with it, maybe get out the substances or which are sometimes very valuable, or we just leave it there. Why not? We did the same thing in Turin on a post-industrial park in the city of Turin in Italy. And it saved us not only a lot of money, it also gave us the chance to do some specific topographical things with it. And many of our colleagues are usually following that because it brings money in. Then the second thing is, because only then you can do something with it as a public space. You're not allowed to walk on something where you can breathe or get the contaminated substances onto your body. So we sometimes have to cover a little bit, or we have to fix the contaminants. For example, in Duisburg, most of the terrain, the earth is, oh my God, my English, I forgot everything, is very like calcium based because of a lot of concrete and all these kind of stuffs. We're very much in the pH, we are very, very high. And basically it needs to stay like this. So you're not allowed to change it, except in some places, because if you change it, you change the pH, you're mobilizing the contaminants. So this is a quite passive strategy, which we could do for the lower contamination levels. We just stabilized the contaminants by keeping it where it was, not touching it. We also didn't unseal the surfaces. We have many, many asphalt surfaces on Duisburg North, and we kept them almost all. Because then the contaminants underneath stay where they are. They don't move until they are possibly in 30 or 50 years not problematic anymore. And the positive thing with all the asphalt we have is we're collecting the rainwater. And we have enough water for our water features. We don't need to take the water from somewhere. We don't need groundwater, which possibly is contaminated. We don't need to take water from the source because it's precious. But we have rainwater, which is the best for a park you can get. And then there were allotments close by. Fortunately, we didn't have to take them off, but usually it happens quite often that they had to be taken off because the contamination was brought in by the dust, by the chimneys and by the processes they had before. But we also created new allotments close by, and the quality is perfect. So we are quite convinced that for most of the cases, this does work. So you need to develop an adapted way to a specific situation, but be aware, sometimes it doesn't. And you need clear surveys in the beginning of what kind of contamination you have and what quantity of contamination you have. And then while working the site over years, because in a short period that can't be done, you work each place individually, which makes you save a lot of money, which makes you save the identity of a place like it is and its specific vegetation. But it is clear that you are working fast. Such a project, such an approach is not really possible. And I remember we did a master plan for the city of Hangshe in how do you say, up the Yellow River. Hangshe, you possibly know. It's an industrial city, partly very beautiful city, I must say. And there's a lot of industry, and we came there expecting that they tell us, yeah, and in 3 months we want the master plan. And we told them, and they didn't ask it, and we were surprised. So we asked them, hey guys, I mean, there's one little thing we want to say. If we do a master plan, this takes a little bit longer. It doesn't cost more, but less people, but takes longer. We need to go step by step. And also doing the project will take longer. And it was fascinating because the people sitting there said, oh, don't worry, we studied many post-industrial projects. We have the time, and you take all the time you need. We were so surprised because even European clients usually ask to have a cool plan right in the beginning. But if possible, if you can convince a client, don't do it. Take your time, take care of the problems and the opportunities you have step by step.
Any more questions? Maybe we'll have one or two questions. Okay. Okay, I will ask a question again. Okay, so
Sorry if I flattened you. I didn't want to do that.
yeah, I have a concern. It's actually the interest to know because it's not mentioned frequently in the publications or lectures. For this type of projects, I just saw from your lecture the horticultural design part. The plants are thriving, prosperous. So I just want to know what is a specific philosophy and methods you have applied on the site for horticultural part.
Yeah, I didn't talk about that specific issue today. That's correct. It's a fair critique, but there's so many layers of intervention. So contamination is one, the historic structures are one, the train tracks is one, the water system is one, and yes, the vegetation is another one, which is extremely important. We could do a lecture only on that even.
Yes.
Basically, what's so fascinating about specifically Duisburg, but many other heavy industry places, is that you have very, very different biotopes. So it's not like in an English landscape garden, one principle overall, which creates different spaces. It's rather that the spaces create a patchwork kind of park. So you have continuous substrates via the train tracks, and you have isolated, we called it lines, and the other we called fields within that, depending on the kind of production they had over there or storage, and depending on what happened before even. And since it's usually all man-made landscape on a kind of man-made plinth, yeah, because you want a horizontal plinth, maybe on terraces, but it's all horizontal. The artificiality and the different availability of water and the different materials create different kinds of vegetation, which is really fascinating. I mean, we had places where we only had a substrate, a very neutral substrate, almost nothing was growing there. And it was open, and you had a black color of the ore surfaces. But there was a very specific biodiversity in there with red list species, so we had to keep it, yeah, although it was very hot. And then there were other places which were just, how can I say, rubble from just taking things up and down and whatever. So you have a different nature, and that was different in every place. I don't know how many biotopes we had. We had people coming from all Europe to study that because the park's completely open. Yeah, there's nothing really fenced off except some minor spaces, which are dangerous still, physically dangerous rather, not because of the contaminants. And you analyze all these very different natures and their beauty. And all these different biotopes need a different approach. So for people working with plants, it was a treasure. And we said, okay, let's understand that vegetation and just develop it further in the same substrate. So we're not changing the substrates. What unfortunately very often is done in post-industrial parks, and I don't think it's good. If possible, rather avoid it. But we developed it further. So we continue this variety of biotopes, this enormous variety of different plant societies within the park. We developed it further, and we added species which work well with it. I mean, I'm a real fan of the Jardin Planétaire of Gilles Clément, who is saying that we have similar living conditions for plants all around the world. And the Jardin Planétaire means that we can take these plants into these specific substrates. Of course, we need to be careful, you know, about aggressive plants and so on, and colonizers. But you could say you can extend it. You can plant other things over there. So, for example, we plant prune trees in some areas because we found the most perfect in this techno-soil situation. In other places, we were rather going for the typical pioneer vegetation, which you know very well in China as well. It's everywhere. The ailanthus was a pest in our country, but we used it specifically because of the specific substrate. We could isolate it also in one area. And so it was about developing further. The good thing with this is if you work adapted, you're investing very little money in the beginning because it's all there, but you're also investing very little money in maintenance because you're not working against the nature of a place. And maintenance of that place is really reachable at a quite low cost. It's quite amazing. But of course, we also have some exceptions. So we created some specific gardens, some contrasting points within the bunkers. And we had a specific garden for the former gardeners of Duisburg North, who have planted, and within the different substrates they found in Duisburg, they collected it and have planted there also the plants from their front house gardens. And this is an enormous garden. It's really fantastic. Unfortunately, the city of Munich, the city of Duisburg, has centralized the gardening of all parks. So they took out the garden central point of Duisburg North and have mixed it with the classic garden department, and that doesn't work at all. So the skills we have developed before, so we skilled masters in gardening. So we had a group over here who was very much working on this. We skilled the people. So these people were fantastic and they knew Duisburg North like their pocket. It was amazing. So they did it also very effectively. But this idea of centralization is wrong. Wrong in many aspects. It's really sad because for such parks, you need a locally based band of dedicated people and gardeners, of people who understand the nature of such a place. You cannot do it with the usual gardening, where it's about the usual trees, the usual lawn, and the usual hedges. You need the specific people. The funny thing is, with that, you save money because you work more adapted. Whereas a centralized garden department is only working with standards, at least in Europe. And that's a bit a downer and is becoming actually a problem. I mean, we're having this situation since 4 years and the maintenance, it doesn't work properly anymore. And I hope they will change that again in the future.
Thank you so much. Okay, there is a question in Chinese. I will translate, try my best. Okay. This question from Sophie. She asked, my question is about, for this type of large-scale project, normally the period is very long, take a long time. So as a director of the design firm, how to run your firm in a sustainable way? I think the question is, you don't have to answer, something you feel convenient to share. Okay. Yeah, I think it's about the management issue, because if it's taken years, and then you probably have to consider how to integrate this type of projects with other projects, right? To generate the sustainable financial flow, those kind of things. That's my guess. Okay. And then her second part of the question is, especially during the pandemic period and during this period of time, how to really supervise the site construction. Yeah. So I'm not sure my translation is totally correct.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the first question about the management, because of course, when I talk about it and the long time spans, it might frighten people and in the end say rather abstain from such a project. Well, what happened basically is that Duisburg North was a test piece. Yeah, test pieces always take longer. We had 10 years to build the park. And I remember I started working on that park when I was still a student. And I was working, besides my work as an architect in Paris, on it sometimes and visiting it. The 10 years were good, but since you do an experiment, you need to do the experiment thoroughly, and everything was new in these years. I'm pretty sure that today you could do such a project in a much shorter time period. I mean, that's the first thing. Simply because most of what we have over there today is common knowledge now. You just have to apply it. And of course, you need to have a little bit of experience with it. At least that's what I would recommend to speed up processes and tackle the worries of people, of responsible people especially. Then the second thing is about management. Today, we are much more sensitive to all this specific types of vegetation than we have been in the early 90s. There, everything was still following postmodernism. Everything was very artificial and thought in a classic way. We had very radical projects also, but usually it was a kind of classic intense park logic which would have been applied. And that was also a result of the competition, by the way. Yeah, I mean, the other competitors, most of them chose a very artificial way on how to do park, which would be extremely intense in maintenance. Here, it's exactly the other way around. When you work adapted, maintenance is much easier. You just need to be ready to educate the people in the knowledge about the plants and the specificities of the site, which are not only about plants, but also about constructions, about engineering, about a specific flow of water, and so on. And following on that, a very different flow of people during daytime and weekends and on event times. It's very interesting, and it's worth it because in the end you save money, because the structure is there, and especially heavy industry is usually constructed in the way that it can stay for another 100 years without doing much. When we've been working the structures of the blast furnaces, for example, we followed a logic of controlled decay, which was then adapted to the idea of keeping it as a monument. So every year, about 3 million euros are invested as an average to keep the whole structures, all the engineered structures. And this is largely enough. I mean, in other places where you do a kind of renewal of the structure, it's much, much, much more expensive. And with a controlled decay, I mean that you take out the little things, those which are really dangerous, which are starting to fall. And you secure places where you want to give people access, and that's it. And it's not much. It's really interesting. You just need some skilled people who understand this kind of environment, and good engineers, you know, who can judge that. And then it's quickly done. It's really an interesting process. So the management, of course, is challenging. Yeah, it needs knowledge, but it can be done with much less people than you think, and much less even in accepting a controlled decay than if you would have new monuments, new pergolas, new buildings, and whatever in a park, because that is intense, because you need to keep them up to standard. Yeah. And that's a good thing. Of course, we always need to differ between light industry structures and heavy industry structures. We need to differ between challenging 3D processes like in Duisburg, where you have all these different layers. You know, you walk up and down 40 to 60 meters on the structures, and in the landscape up to 15, 16 meters, which is spectacular. Yeah. But usually industry is not like that. We've been working on a little advisory scheme in where was that? It's somewhere east of Beijing, and the landscape, it was also blast furnaces, was absolutely flat, and the structures were standing there. It was a newer kind of industry without trains, rather truck system and conveyor belts, and the structures were very light, which of course you have to judge then also with experts whether you can do something with it, and then management becomes a much more crucial issue. And the decision on what to keep and what to continue to take and also to maintain over years for the people is an important one, and sometimes makes a lot of sense, sometimes it doesn't. So then management becomes much more intense.
Thank you so much. I want to share a comment from architect from Sri Lanka. It's Harsh Nesaka. I'm not sure this lady or gentleman. He or she said, Tilman, the sadness on our part is not because you haven't interest, but you provoke thought. We need time to think about all you have said. I think it's a very fair comment, and I think it's a really proactive talk, and it's two projects really gives a lot of inspiration. And
yeah, there's one more question in the chat. That's interesting. I don't know how much time we have. I have some more minutes. No problem.
Yeah, if you have minutes, please feel free to answer that. This is quite a long question. Yeah.
But it's interesting. It's about. I can read it if you want to, by Rui. How to establish a scientific landscape design standard system and how to judge a reconstruction project. That's a good question. For example, this is an abandoned industrial area, how to design? I can answer that. On the one hand, it should retain the industrial, historical, and cultural symbols. On the other hand, it can activate the vitality of the abandoned park and activate the local economy and avoid over-design. How to comment after the completion of the project? Is there a system that brings about economy, history, and culture, service life? Wait, I see that LAF is establishing landscape performance standards. Can this also be considered? Well, the thing is, the first part of the question is how to design. I mean, when we design, we base it on something. That's all. You know, when you work in the mountains, you have to study the mountain and the mountain vegetation, the animals, the stone, and how you can walk it, how you can work the material. And you just do exactly the same thing with this place. You study the steel, the concrete, you study the engineering processes, you study how it worked once, you know, how it functioned, because then you understand why the structures are there and how good they are and how you can reuse them. And you need to accept the nature. I mean, in nature, I mean the nature of something, yeah, not the nature as being the green, you know, the fishes and the deer. I mean the nature of the materials and what they are for such a construction. And then you just become a little bit like the engineer who have constructed it. You continue constructing it to deal with it, and it steers an enormous creativity. That's one thing. And then when you judge on it, I think we could set up principles on how to judge post-industrial projects. We could, but I'm very careful with that because sometimes intervening more, changing more is necessary to make it a good project, and it's for a good cause. What I usually don't think is so nice if the industrial fabric just is an object within, is a kind of monument where the landscape around is completely new and reconstructed. And usually I'm not happy about such projects. I think that these structures deserve that we use them, yeah, that we can go into them, work with them, and be within them, and enjoy new functionality within this. Because then we can feel the power, then we can use the power. And it's not so much about, you know, adding whatever crazy stuff. I think it's much easier. Easier in principle, of course, becoming like an engineer. I mean, these guys who constructed it have been highly talented engineers in these days, in these times. Studying it a little bit allows us to learn from the existing, like we learn from a normal landscape somewhere when we do a garden, and then transform it into something new. I think this is, so the design process is much more about first, let's have a look and see what we can do with it creatively before we propose to do whatever on top. That's the starting point. Besides that, then, I mean, it takes years until it's like studying landscape architecture, until you really can do it. Then another part of the question is how we activate them. And this is exactly, we have to invent the functions into them. When we find a place, we can say, oh, that's where we can play tennis, or that's where we can do the climbing. That's what the Alpine Club has thought. You know, in the beginning, they wanted to put whatever, but then they found out the existing cracks in the concrete are already perfect for doing free climbing. It's fantastic. It's all there. So you just add a little bit to make it function. And that's how we do the whole structure. You know, if you have a blast furnace, the greatest thing is to walk up like you walk onto a mountain and have a great view. And we detected that this is the right approach when we found, you know, the little locks on top. You know, it's very typical when a couple goes somewhere and puts a lock to say, we love each other forever. I don't know how many sword locks I know, but because not everybody stays together. But once you have these locks on your structure, or they take the marriage photos on top of the platform, then you know you made it. It has become a place of identity. And it's usually the people living around who suddenly accept this, hey, this is our history. It's like Versailles in Paris. That's their history. So you go there, you say, that's where my ancestors worked, where the people who lived here before worked. I mean, this is history and it's full of it. It's fantastic. And it managed a wealth. Once you get over that picture and don't see it anymore as destruction, dirt, contamination, danger, but something great. Yeah, at least it was great. Then you can accept also living with it. And that is this point, how to create new value and how to have new functions, new functionality. Of course, sounds easier than in the end it is. You need a lot of skills and knowledge about such things, but it is possible, and it's quickly possible because the construction is there. You know, when you reuse the halls, you just need to clean them and it's there. You don't need to take it down and build the perfect meeting center. You don't need to take it down and rebuild it because you want to have the same thing. You can use it, usually. Sometimes structures, we had the Sinter plant, which was on the other side, right behind that Clearwater Canal, which I showed you in one picture. There was a Sinter plant, and that was heavily contaminated. So we had to take it out into the concrete. The contamination has gone. We couldn't keep it. Every dust was dangerous, so it had to be cleaned. And this was the only thing. It was destructed at the very beginning. This was the opening ceremony, the destruction of the chimney. I was disappointed, but my father said to me, no other chance on this one. So yeah, that's how it is. And then we had concerts with up to 15,000 people in the same place. It's okay. It's fine. Yeah, and history comes with it. I don't think there shouldn't be any standards. You know, you need to be very careful with standards. Because these things are not standard. It's industry. They are made on purpose. So we have to accept the standards existing. But you can adapt security, you can adapt other things, you can adapt safety, and then you can use it like you walk into the mountains. That's something we need to take it much more easy and not be too afraid of that. But we need good partners to analyze stability, longevity, and contamination with you, and then you're on a good track.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time to wrap up this talk, and it's quite a fascinating meeting on that. Hopefully you can join us on site and visit Hong Kong in the near future. And,
I hope so.
Yeah, this is also quite a fascinating city. You may see something interesting and relevant to your exploration.
Quite something, I think.
Yeah. Actually, we have quite a famous project in the middle of Hong Kong. It was transformed from an old prison facility into a plaza and some wonderful recreational and cultural buildings. So we have a lot of sites to see, to share with you. Okay, so if you come here in the future. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your passion and open mind and everything you did for this event. I know you are extremely busy, and I appreciate so much for your time and share the wonderful story in depth with us. And also, I want to thank you for all the attendance from people at different cities. And we have other big portion of the audience on YouTube and Facebook, I guess. So we'll also share the video on the website, official website, so everyone can have a chance to revisit or and reflect this talk. Thank you so much, Tilman. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, have a good rest of the day and have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.